Welcome back for another episode of Generation Breakdown, where we take pop culture and dissect it hopefully better than you did back when you were in school dissecting that frog. We analyze it to the utmost degree. Why? Because, well, we care. That's right, we care. This episode, we are going to be looking at different comic book artists throughout, the incarnation of comic books and see how their style has defined certain characters, certain issues, and certain people who try to emulate their style. As always, I'm Derrick, and I'm here with Jamal.
How's it going?
And, I think we should start with, who's an artist that you look at and you go, I like his style?
I think the first artist that I noticed was Mark Silvestri.
Okay.
And I noticed him back in the late 80s, early 90s when he was doing the Uncanny X-Men.
Yep.
And that was when I first got into comics and everything, and I just kind of really liked his art for some reason. It was just very dynamic, I think is the best word I was looking for, pretty much. And he was the artist that kind of got me into it. He was one that kind of stood out to me, the first one that kind of stood out to me as, wow, that's pretty good. And I would always try to kind of copy that, copy his art and draw his stuff and stuff like that. I always sucked at it, but even still, it was always and still is. It's still very, very good.
See, for me, I took a course on comic books and graphic novels in college. So I guess the first one that
you had a course for that?
Yeah, they offer it every 3 years at Brockport. I took it and it was awesome.
Amazing.
But what I was looking at is more like an art or a literary form. It's actually a women's studies and an art course. But beyond that, taking that course, the one who really stood out to me was Alex Ross. And for those who don't know, he's the one that for Marvel he did Earth X. But probably his most well-known work is for DC. And that was doing, Kingdom Come. And
Alright, yeah, I've seen this stuff. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. He draws really realistically. And the reason why he does that and what stood out to me about was when he draws characters, he actually looks at historical figures and bases it on them. So we get really expressful faces. Like for Kingdom Come, when he drew Batman, he actually based that off of Thomas Edison.
What?
Yeah. If you look at whenever they show Bruce Wayne in that comic, and if you look at a picture of Thomas Edison, you can see the correlation between the two.
Okay. Interesting.
And when it came to actual realistic individuals in the comics, such as you do see Booster Gold's restaurant in there, and of course he has all the memorabilia, and on the back wall in one panel is the picture of King Tut from the 1960s Batman TV show. So of course he looked at a picture of King Tut from there and just drew him. But before that, being a child, I was born in the late 80s, so I was exposed to a lot of early 90s comics. So those who stood out then were, of course, Todd McFarlane. And
Spawn, yeah, you did Spawn and Spider-Man for a while.
Yep. And also there was Rob Liefeld, which brings up a lot of talk here and there when you talk about his artwork. People, they bash it left and right because of they call it his lack of ability and his sexism.
Well, I think a lot of comics in the early 90s were sexist back then.
They're still sexist now in a way if you look at it.
Yeah, but not as bad as it was back then. I would say, for example, I would say that what I thought kind of really changed the game for comic book artists and the quality of what they did was Jim Lee.
Okay.
And Jim Lee started out with Uncanny X-Men.
Yep.
And then started the new just X-Men series for about several issues, and then he left to go do Image along with several other comic artists, of which Silvestri, Liefeld, and the other guy you mentioned.
Ross.
Not Ross. The guy who did Spawn.
Oh, Todd McFarlane.
McFarlane, yeah. All those guys left, created Image Comics. but he had an art style that was very, I almost want to say scientific, and everything like the.
It was realistic in it.
It it kind of was and it kind of wasn't, but it was just it looked like everything was very measured and very drawn. It wasn't as artsy as it was technical. That's what I was. It was very technical what he did, but at the same time, he was also the one who kind of introduced kind of like the whole kind of perfect body kind of superhero. So all the guys had like were ripped and had abs and everything, and all the women going back to the whole sexist thing, always had the skin tight suits and kind of had like the model poses, so that their ass was always kind of jutting out and in these ridiculous poses. It was just kind of like, it's kind of like what? And I had a friend a few years back who was into comics, and she said that her biggest wish was that a lot of comics were not like that, would draw women in that way. But that being said, though. Lee kind of changed up everything because he kind of turned it into kind of pop culture-ish. So if you remember, the X-Men cartoon back in the 90s.
Oh, who doesn't?
He was the one who, those costumes that you saw in that cartoon were designed by Jim Lee for the comics. And they were the mainstay.
That's right.
For the comics for like 10 plus years. So, and then after that, it's just like all the comic book art since then really kind of upped their game in terms of the quality of how it came out and everything else.
Okay, so let's break this down, because when comic books first came out, they didn't come in the book form. They were, of course, the Sunday strips.
Okay.
And then people started collecting them and binding them, and that's how we actually got comic books. So when we get to like the really early ages of comics, we're seeing things that are almost, I want to say, they're like they're like watching Looney Tunes. They're not overly detailed. They're kind of goofy, and those that were like Superman stuff like that, you see a very non-detailed, it's a person, you can tell it is, but it's lacking detail. And I think that comes from the whole thing of it being the comic strip format.
Well, yeah, there was for a while, in my opinion. I think a lot of comics didn't have a lot of the dynamicism, basically energy that a lot of modern comics have. Was very kind of, it felt like a still painting, or it felt like a still kind of like shot of something. And for a while that worked, and then about the time when Civil Street came along, he started doing certain things that were kind of different. So, like for example, I think he was the one where I really noticed where whenever he drew Wolverine, Wolverine in the comics is always known for these leaping attacks at people because he's like short and he has like claws and everything. So he's always kind of like leaping at people, and that was the first one that where it kind of felt like the character's actually coming at you. So there was an energy in how he drew that, and then again, Jim Lee kind of further expounded upon that, and kind of added lots of different colors and kind of almost like a industrial type color to it that didn't feel like it was just colored with a color pencil, so that made it more vibrant, more energetic, and everything else. McFarlane, when he drew Spider-Man, he always drew these like weird contortions, which was always weird.
It was weird, but it caught your eye.
Yeah, it did its. If that was his job, then it did it well. Because I remember even to this day, it just looked weird looking at him, because it's like someone was like bent his body in several different space, places and everything, and it was just very bizarre. But you mentioned Liefeld, and Liefeld is.
He's a blessing and a curse to comic books for me.
Why is that?
Well, if you look at his artwork, he's the one that draws women with big hips, big tits, little toothpick waist, where if they move in any way, they're going to snap in half. Guys, he drew muscles upon muscles upon muscles. And it's just something where it's just like, these are not anatomically correct at all. He can't draw feet. That's one of his biggest things people point out. Like, look at his feet whenever he draws them. They don't look like feet.
Well, I think that's kind of ridiculous, because there was a lot of artists who didn't draw feet right.
Right. But it's something where if you look at his characters, he's very another thing people point out is like the design of his pockets upon pockets upon pockets on his characters.
They
But
did the same thing though.
I know, but people like to point out Liefeld the most.
Right.
And he's someone that actually is one of the. Apparently, he's the most easiest guy to work with in the industry, but he can be a dick sometimes too. So I guess that comes hand in hand. But one of the things I think he's a blessing for is he created a lot of characters that are still around today, and there are fan favorites. One of the biggest ones, and this has become something again because recently the footage became leaked, is Deadpool.
Right.
And with the release of the whole the test footage that they did, apparently like Fox has announced that okay, we are looking at a script. We are looking to move forward with this project now that there's a fan outcry, and there was a fan outcry because of how popular his characters become. Mm-hmm. Whether they become popular at his inception or someone else taking the reins.
Well, I don't know. Like my feeling with Liefeld was that he was very. I mean, he was a product at the time.
Oh yeah.
I think. I mean, about that time, a lot of comic artists were starting to build their characters like, steroid junkies.
Well, it's something where the 90s are described as being extreme and everything. We had extreme 3D Doritos, for God's sakes, in the 90s.
I remember that one. But, yeah, but it was... I liked his art in terms of... again, there was an energy to it. What I didn't like about it was that a lot of it seemed kind of generic and kind of copied. There wasn't really anything really unique about most of the characters that he created, except for certain ones like Domino, Cable, and Deadpool and Shatterstar.
But even then, if you look at Deadpool, he pretty much took that template and brought it to a different character, which was Deathstroke.
Kind of, but at the same time, a lot of artists were again, everyone was. I think a lot of people were just trying to copy Jim Lee as well, or at least they're trying to copy his template of how he did X-Men.
Okay.
So you have like your leader person, you have like maybe one or two women or whatever, and then you have your berserker, okay, and just a lot who like does like slashing or stabbing or something of that sort.
He's a close combat guy.
Right. Yeah, and it was, he was copying, like other artists were copying just that whole kind of format, which, because of that, made it feel generic after a while. And like we deal with certain characters like Deadpool, that was like okay, because that was done in a unique fashion. The art, his costume wasn't that unique, but the character was, and how that was done, and it was, I didn't really have that much of a problem with it, but I did notice that a lot of the stuff at that time that he did was very generic, to me.
Okay.
I think during the '90s, a lot of comic art was trying to copy X-Men too much.
Well, what about another product of the 90s we mentioned before is Todd McFarlane. His tends to stand out.
Right.
Because he kind of cut his own way.
I'll be honest, I never read Spawn. I saw the cartoon, the HBO cartoon.
Okay.
But I never actually read the comics.
But have you seen images from the comics?
I have.
Okay.
And it's very good. Like I was saying earlier, his artwork was always very dynamic. There was a dynamicism about how he drew, and then how whoever his colorist did the colors and everything. It was just, like you said earlier, like it really stood out to you.
Oh, yeah.
And it was just kind of just drew your attention. And then on top of that, it was interesting because it was a character who was already dead, so there was a neatness about that. It was a black character, because the original character of Spawn was originally a black CIA agent or something like that.
Yep.
Who had been killed. So, there was that whole element to that as well. So that part, that part was pretty good. But I kind of feel like, there was a space, for a while where story-wise there was kind of a deadfall in how comics were being done. And but the artwork was starting to get better. And the colors, more importantly, were starting to get better. It felt less like a comic strip and more like a graphic novel, even with just like your paperback comics, which I liked. I would buy a comic just because of the artwork, even if the story sucked because it was that good. And then there are other, and sometimes vice versa, you know. And then I think recently the one who I've really come to admire was Jan Durisma.
Jan Durisma?
Right.
What does she do?
She, and yes, it's a she, so it's a female comic book artist for those you don't know. She did a lot of Star Wars comics for Dark Horse.
Okay.
And and her artwork was always. I liked her artwork because it was like really, really good. It was realistic, and I liked how she did some of the lightsaber combat and things like that. It was just there was just a dynamicism to how she drew and a realism and how she did expressions and whatnot, and it was just like really awesome that I liked about it.
Okay. Now, one of the things that we talked about, I think you mentioned that people were calling for something that's a little more simplistic or realistic as opposed to the extreme thing of the 90s. Like, there was an outcry for that, and that's how we get something like a Jim Lee who goes, I'm going to find that sort of medium.
What do you mean?
Well, if you think about it, you got the Liefeld extreme, you have McFarlane doing his own thing, and Jim Lee, he creates something that you said was proportional instead of the big hulking shoulders and arms, which he does for a few characters. But
that's true. But they're still on steroids.
But at the same time, we also have people who do things very overly simplistically. Like, have you ever read Mouse by Art Spiegelman?
No, I haven't.
It is a 2-part thing. He's a writer himself and an artist, and he followed the story of his grandfather when he was in World War II Poland.
Yes, I am familiar with it now.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
So you know the style where it's just simple shapes to suggest animals as people. And he just decided, like, I want these to be simple shapes so that way it focuses on the story. And it's something where, in my comic books and graphic novels class, we compared that war story to something that was a little more recent. And it was very graphic, the recent one. Like, you saw dead bodies with guts hanging out of them. And it was all black and white stuff on both comic ends. Mm-hmm. But both to serve a different purpose. Whereas Spielman used his art to go, I'm going to focus on the story because that's where my focus is. Where the other one was, this is the horrors of war. And I have to show this to an audience who, they'll see it on the news and stuff, but news you can turn off. Or news can edit itself. Here you can't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was... I mean, with any art form, you're dealing with an artist who's trying to express something of themselves in that. And that's always going to come out. So it doesn't surprise me. I don't necessarily have a problem with different artists having their own different take on it, and things of that sort. I will note though that there are some art where they kind of start to become more realistic. So, like for example, when they redid X-Force. So, just a little bit of history.
Which redoing of X-Force?
Well, just a brief history. X-Force first came out in the 1990s, and it was
Liefeld.
Liefeld created that. And then it kind of dropped off for a while because it just had no direction. And then it came back about 5 years ago now, I think, where it was called, it was just called X-Force, and it was when they were just kind of a hit team.
Wolverine, X-23.
Right. And initially... it was supposed to be the real concept anyway. It was supposed to be a hit team. But in any case, the artwork for that was extremely good. And it was graphic.
Oh, yeah.
Yet still comic booky. So that was an interesting kind of blend with that.
Which is interesting because when the Marvel Now came out, they had 2 different X-Force teams to begin with. Mm-hmm. Right off the bat, you had Cable and X-Force, which... traded hands, I think, between 2 artists at one point. Mm-hmm. But theirs became like Cable. It was not as bulky as the Liefeld one, but he was still a bulky guy to a point where just like, he took a step back from the X-Force rendition that you were talking about, and then you end up with this other one where it's Psylocke and Storm, and that was Uncanny X-Force, and that one I also believe traded hands, but at the same time, it kind of went the route of the X-Force that you were talking about there, Jamal, but at the same time, it felt a little more comic booky, just because of how flat certain things looked.
Yeah, and again, it's all about the artist and how they're expressing it. It's nice to see that different artists are not trying to necessarily copy other artists, and some of it isn't always going to be your flavor, But at the same time, some of it maybe. So when I was collecting comics, there would be a point where if I liked the artist, I would collect that book until that artist stopped doing it. And when they wouldn't do it, they weren't doing it anymore, I stopped collecting it until then the next issue came out, but they were back on it again. For me, it was always a blend of story and art. For me, in order for me to spend money on it.
See, for me, when I was younger, it would be like, oh, the artwork, because that's the first thing you notice is the cover. Now I'm starting to realize, story is what I'm drawn towards. I mean, it's just my desire as being someone older. Now, just like, you know what? If I'm going to pick this up for like $3-4, I want something I'm going to enjoy and want to continue. And I think that's why there's a big resurgence of either getting the omnibus of certain comic issues, i.e., like a bunch of people are now buying the Walking Dead ones because of the whole TV show and people getting interested because of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, the whole idea of the graphic novels is popular now because it's simpler. You don't have to go out every single month and get the next issue and the next issue. You can just wait about 2 or 3 months until the arc is done, and usually they're kind of good about within about a month's time. They put them together, put it in a graphic novel, just buy the graphic novel, and there you go.
And they usually sometimes tend to be more of a self-contained story where it's just like, and it's done. You don't have to buy more, but this is it. This is...
Yeah, you can, but you don't have to. But
yeah.
Another thing, too, that I think has influenced a lot of comic book art has been the influence of Japanese manga.
Oh, yes.
Which is, if you don't know what that is, manga is basically Japanese comics. And they are a style unto themselves. And the way that they draw their art is that, they're different extremes, obviously. But there's a lot more focus on momentum and energy.
Yep.
So you're whenever someone is attacking someone, you'll see these lines kind of rushing by you and things like that. And yeah, the times it can be very, very graphic, even by Western standards. And other times it can be extremely kiddie So there's a wide range of styles within that. But I do think that has played its own part in how comic books and artists have kind of taken their art now, because if they want to communicate something kind of more intimidating or something like that, they will try to copy some of their poses and things like that. So
well, one of the biggest ones and probably one of the more popular ones to actually try to copy that style would be the Scott Pilgrim graphic novels.
Mm-hmm.
Because just looking at them and the fact that they are in the small digest style books, or at least that's how they originally came out, the idea of them being in the black and white format, with the exception of the few pages in one of the issues which they make note of, that in itself was an homage to this is Japanese manga telling a Western style story, with of course Western influence being an emphasis on video games, which ironically enough was something that started over in Japan.
Right. Yeah, and so it's interesting this kind of seeing it kind of take off there. Another thing that I also noticed too was how big comics were in France.
I didn't know that they were actually big in France.
They are. It's very strange to me, coming from America, because even though comics are starting to be more accepted as kind of more mainstream, they're not kind of geeky, kind of side thing, that you kind of hide in the dark with. It can still be perceived sometimes as for kids, or not something that's not for adults. And that there's not that in Japan, there's not that in France, in my experience. It's still and has been very mainstream, very popular. You'll see them up front with everything else and all the other books on politics and God knows what else. Um, and it's very interesting. It's very unique, and I always thought that was kind of interesting. And it's just now in America that we're starting to kind of see that, um, you know, you can be older and still read comics, and that isn't that. There's nothing wrong with that. But we're still in a point in transition with that though too. So
Now, I do want to bring this up, and I know we're talking about comic book artists, but something is always brought up with people going, well, more people are buying comics now, more people are reading comics now, and that's of course because of the whole idea of a cinematic universe being held by DC and Marvel and Fox having its own little thing and Sony having Spider-Man, and that's just bringing it more forward to the public eye and people wanting to go back and look at older comics.
well, that's always been there though. I mean, that you can go back to Spider-Man. When Spider-Man and X-Men came out, people were starting getting big in the comics.
Oh yeah.
So it wasn't just when Avengers came out that suddenly everyone wants to buy comics now.
But it's something where the character who was portrayed in that movie, they're seeing an influx as of, like, if a new Batman movie came out, people are going to start buying more Batman comics because they want to read up on the stories.
Mm.
So with these properties have been around for years, let's talk about some older comic book artists who actually brought some of these characters to life, like Steve Ditko and his work on Spider-Man.
Okay, what?
Are you familiar with Ditko?
Not by name.
Okay, he's the original artist for Spider-Man, and one of the things that that Stan Lee will rave about him is the fact that Ditko will he'll draw out whatever it is, give it to Stan Lee, and Stan Lee could just look at it and just fill in the words. And that's a lot of flack what Stan Lee gets from certain people is going, oh, Ditko did all the work. Stan Lee just had to look at it and just go, and he'll say this, and he'll say that, and Excelsior, and I am done.
Mm.
But at the same time, it's a collaboration between the two. He actually defined through his artwork the idea of going, you know what, this person is expressive this way. This person is expressive that way, and you could take out all the words and you could still know what's going on in the story. Besides the little snapshots you would get in like the original Superman comics by Schuster.
So he was trying to communicate the story through body language.
Yes.
Okay.
Probably not as extreme as we see with McFarlane with contorted Spider-Man is spaghetti webs, is what people would call him, and he was actually told to stop doing that. But going from Steve Ditko to even talk about Jack Kirby and the advent of the Kirby bubble. Is that a term you heard?
Yes.
Okay. For those of you who don't know, the Kirby bubble is Jack had this weird way of just drawing not a weird way, but an interesting way to draw like force fields and stuff like that. Instead of doing a straight line, he would put in these little dot bubbles, these little bursts of oxygen and ozone, I guess is what we would call it, to reflect rays. And people actually look back at that, and that's actually an art term now. Like, artists look at that and go, if I want to do this, and people will know, that's a Kirby bubble. The fact that he did this, and it's a pity that Jack is dead, because he's someone that people think should get more recognition than Stan Lee, because of all the characters that he helped create. But at the same time, he's gone. And sort of Stan Lee just steamrolled over him, because Stan Lee's a showman. Jack wasn't.
I think there's this whole story behind that, with his daughters or his children or something like that just came up about a few months ago, but I don't remember what it was, so I'll have to get back to you on that.
That will be a podcast for another time when we talk about comic book characters and rights.
Right. But I will say this, though, is that back in the day, 50s, 40s and all that, there wasn't a lot of people who really, I don't think, cared as much about the detail and stuff about comics. It was still considered a kiddie thing. Because it's a kiddie thing, it's going to be treated in kind of a kiddie style. So it's not going to be, taken as, seriously and everything else. And on top of that, you had the comic code that kind of came out that put restrictions on back in the 50s, about what they could show and what they couldn't show, because in the 50s, a lot of the comics arts and everything was very horror-based, and stuff like that. So I think that if you're looking at older artists, they're constrained by limitation of both the culture that they were in and the regulations that they had to work under. Whereas now there's a lot more liberty with how comic books can do their art and how they can draw everything, and for that matter, what they can draw, and just a matter of who has the biggest balls, basically, to kind of push that limit. I just read a graphic novel of Batwoman.
Okay.
And for those of you who don't know, Batwoman is another character from Batman's world. And she's kind of not really considered part of the family, it's weird. But in any case,
okay.
She basically is someone else who became a vigilante in Gotham City and whatever, and took on a symbol of the bat because Batman saved her at one point and she got inspired.
So it's idolizing a hero.
Not kind of, but not exactly either.
Okay.
But that being said, though, what has been made to be one of the defining characteristics of Batwoman was that she's a lesbian. And I was reading through one of the graphic novels the other day, and there was about a 6-page panel of her that was diverting between a sidekick that she had just fired and her sleeping with another woman. And they kept kind of going back and forth, trying to indicate they were happening at the same time. And the only reason that was interesting was because, 30 years ago, whatever, you would never see something like that.
Oh, no. One of the big things, Jim Steranko, he's the one that brought Nick Fury to S.H.I.E.L.D.
Mm-hmm.
And he brought pop art, actually, to the whole idea of in comic books. You started seeing more pop art instead of just these panels.
Okay.
And one of the things that he drew, there was, it's a series of different panels, and there's no words, it's just images, and it's suggesting the fact that he's going to have sex. There's, hand holding, there's kissing, you see, a pair of lips, and apparently the comic book code said, you can't have silhouettes there, so they made him put an image of a gun in a holster. And you laugh, because you know exactly what that's suggesting. And to this day, Jim Steranko goes, you know what? What I had drawn there was nothing compared to that. That is far more sexual than anything I had in mind.
No, I'm laughing because I'm like, how is a gun holster supposed to... What's the point?
The idea is that they were about to have sex, and he just had silhouettes holding each other. And what they want was... So what he replaced was, it's Nick Fury's uniform on the ground, and there, of course, in his uniform, he has the gun holster and the guns in the holster. And that's what it symbolizes. And he's like, that's a little more, because think of it. The soldier in war, the idea of the gun, people always say a gun's a phallic symbol.
I'll be honest with you, that thought never occurred to me. That thought would have never occurred to me at all. And maybe it's just me and I was completely oblivious to it, which is a possibility. But I never would have thought of that, ever.
I'm going to see if I should pull that up so that way you see the whole series of images. If I can't, I am sorry.
Right. But in any case, so if you had to compare the art between back, in the 40s and 50s and what it is now, what would you say?
You're right about the whole less detail. Their uniforms and the colors used in them tend to be the thing that stands out. But I don't think that's because they cared less. I think it's actually because there was less people working on it. And they were all hand-drawn. I mean, how many characters did Jack Kirby had to draw out while Stan Lee standing over him going, we're going to do Iron Man, we're going to do the Hulk, and we're going to do the Fantastic Four. Well, wait, that might be a Steve Ditko property. But, he has to draw over the course of every week having these things come out. 5, 6, maybe 10 issues. And it's all him. Now, when we get to more modern things, we mentioned again and again Todd McFarlane. He's one of the people that really pushed for and actually utilized more digital art in his stuff to actually make it faster for him. Yeah, he had to draw it out, but then he could do all the coloring and shading, or whoever he had doing it, do it right there on the computer. It could be mass-produced more.
Okay.
So instead of having to draw everything, it's there, and if a correction needs to be made, it's done. And whole bubble and artwork on a computer, so much easier.
I will say this, is that I think, now that you bring that up, I think the colorist is probably the main reason why the quality has gone up in comics than perhaps even the drawers, because the colorists are the ones who kind of who breathe the life into whatever the picture's trying to portray.
Right.
And I think Scott Williams was the colorist that Jim Lee was always working with, and his stuff was just amazing. I mean, I don't even know how he got some of the reflections and details he would have in that and everything, but his stuff was just amazing. And if you ever see Jim Lee's stuff by itself, it's good, but it's not the greatest. And you see some of his early stuff when he was doing Punisher War Journal, it's good, but whatever have you. And then you get to like X-Men 1, and it's just like, damn, it's just like vibrant and all colorful. And then he needed Wildcats because he had created that series.
Wildcats, I forgot about Wildcats.
Yeah, it was like very colorful. It was very vibrant and just kind of like.
But it still had that '90s extreme feel in the stories.
Kind of, but it was the colors that kind of drew you into it. I don't think the whole extreme thing would have worked without the improvement of the colors.
Okay. I can't find the Nick Fury gun holster one. One of these days I will show you a documentary, and it shows the original panel, and it shows that.
Right.
If you guys want, there are several comic book documentaries up on Netflix. Jim Steranko's usually someone that they have speak on there because of the whole pop art thing coming to comics and make it mainstream. Also, the creation of S.H.I.E.L.D. So look that up. We talked about the idea of digital art. One of the things we didn't talk about, and this is something certain people like to use, and it's a style that I believe it's called overpainting or underpainting, where you take photography and you put filters over it. Me personally, I've seen a few comics done that way. Have you?
I'm still not quite familiar with how you're describing that. I mean,
the idea is to take actual real images, and this has become more of like an online comic thing because of how quickly you can do it. You take the image that you're using, and then you put several filters over it to make it look more comic booky, but you can still tell it's an actual photo of something.
All right, I have seen it before. I just never didn't know that's what they were doing, but I have seen that before.
What are your opinions on people doing that, as opposed to actually either doing painting on a computer or actually sitting there hand drawing it out?
I don't have a problem with it. I think it's perfectly fine. Again, it's an art form, and when it comes to art, there can be many different expressions of that kind of art. Doesn't have to be confined to one type of expression. Because at that point it becomes dogmatic and, just very restrictive at that point.
So the artwork is an expression of oneself.
It always is.
Yeah.
Any art form, period, is an expression of oneself. And it's, no matter what you do, singing, writing, or anything like that.
Now, as we're winding down here, one more thing, and that is digital comics.
Okay.
Comics are now, like, you can open up any comic and say, hey, download these issues here, download these issues there. To me personally, actual pages in a comic book or a graphic novel or what have you will never be replaced, even if it is by digital comics. It will. There's something about, like, there's certain people who go like, yeah, you can have an e-reader to read your books, but there's nothing that's going to replace the actual physical contents there. Be able to thumb through, and if you do this with your comics, I don't know what you're doing, but in the actual book, you can actually take notes. But what's your opinion about digital comics as opposed to the actual handheld, like the actual pages and the flipping through?
I'm pretty simplistic when it comes to that. I think to each their own. For me, I'm not that big into digital. That's not my thing. I'm on top of that, I'm very picky about what I read. I will not pick up something just because it's X-Men or it's Avengers or whatever. I've seen those titles have sucky story and sucky art, and I just and I wouldn't touch it. But I get, some people may be into digital art. Maybe it's simpler for them, read it on their iPad or something like that. And if that's what they're into, then great, sure. I think, so bottom line is to each their own. It goes back to what we were saying before. It's an expression, and I don't believe that it should any art form should be conformed to dogmatically to one type of expression and having to say, no, it's only this.
So we're in the same boat where personally we prefer actual physical thing as opposed to going on the computer and clicking on it.
I will say this, I have yet to see something that has made me want to do that, but you never know. But to this day, I have not come across anything that has inspired me to do that.
So that's a challenge there. So whoever out there wants to make their own digital artwork, send us your comic books. Yeah, actually, send us, if you can make your own digital comic, maybe a strip or an actual full thing,
Nice.
Send it to, we'll read it. We will read it, and we will review it at one point or another in a different podcast.
Gotcha.
It's going to be fun and amazing. Send us send us who you think is the artist that really stands out to you, and particularly what works of theirs stand out to you. If there's an artist that we didn't touch on that you feel needed to be touched on, let us know. If there's one that we briefly touch on, you go like, hold on, you're ignoring this work from them, look at this work here, let us know. How do you let us know? Through email. How do you get a hold of us through email? Easy. You email Gen Breakdown. That's GEN breakdown at gmail.com. Signing off, I'm Derek.
And I'm Jamal.
And don't forget, you turn the page and you wash your hands. You turn your page and you wash your hands. And then you turn the page and then you wash your hands.